Reaching financial freedom can feel impossible, especially if you're on a low income. But I don't think it's as hard as a lot of people think. So for the past year, I've been living on less than minimum wage to prove that anyone can retire early, no matter how much money they make. And in this video, I'm going to share exactly how I survived on less than minimum wage and whether it's possible to even retire early on a minimum wage income. But before I get into all of that, I need to give you a little bit of context. I live in the state of Virginia, where minimum wage is $12 an hour. Over the course of a year, that comes out to $24,960. But after taxes, that would be just $21,266. So while I earn more than that, my goal was to live on less than $21,266 for an entire year. Living on $21,266 might not have been a huge challenge if I lived in one of the cheaper towns or cities, but unfortunately, I do not. I work in McLean, Virginia, which is the opposite of affordability. I mean, average rent is pushing $3,000 a month, and I'm obviously not buying a home around here on a minimum wage income. Those high prices are fine for most people because the average income for this area is about $94,000. But it's not going to be easy to make it on just minimum wage. But over the last year, I was able to not only survive on less than minimum wage, but even have some savings left over. So let me show you exactly how I lived on less than minimum wage. On a minimum wage income, there just isn't room to spend money on things that you don't need. But there are 3 expenses that almost everyone has to have. But while most people spend more than 60% of their income on just these 3 expenses, I was able to save thousands of dollars per year on each of them. By the way, I'm able to calculate all of this because I track my expenses really carefully, and you should too. I dropped a budgeting template in the description if you aren't doing this already. Most people's biggest expense is housing, and I already showed you how expensive rent is here, which is more than a minimum wage by itself. Since this is such a huge expense, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to spend less money on this. And really, there are just 2 factors that made a huge difference. The first is just location. Living in downtown city centers is insanely expensive, but things get way more affordable just a few miles down the road. I still live in a nice neighborhood with access to everything I need, but I'm paying half as much money for rent. The second way to save on housing was by living with roommates. Even single bedroom apartments in my neighborhood cost around $1,700 a month. So renting out a townhouse with a few other roommates was the only way to get my rent to about $1,000 a month. I have a whole video on this where I go into more detail and other strategies that I use to save money on housing, so you might want to check that out if you're interested. But even doing all of that, housing is still a huge expense, and last year it cost me $12,141. With a minimum wage income, I have just $9,125 after rent to spend on everything else. And to make any money at all, I have to get to work. So let's talk about transportation. Driving a car is way more expensive than people think. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average single American, like me, spends over $8,700 per year just on transportation. And that's the average for all of America. Where I live, it's probably even more than that. Spending that much money on transportation is not an option for me if I want to live on less than minimum wage. So to keep my expenses lower on this, I never bought a car in the first place. Riding a bike is such a ridiculously powerful savings hack. I might not want to do it forever, but it made it so much easier to live on less than minimum wage. My bike and public transportation only cost me $245 last year, which means I still have $8,880 left over to spend on everything else I need. And that's great news because there's only one more thing that I have to spend money on, which is food. Whenever I do a coaching call, one of the first expenses I look at is what a person spends on food every year. This usually isn't someone's biggest expense, but it's usually one of the fastest ways to save an extra $1,000, or even more. And to live on less than minimum wage, I obviously wasn't going to be eating out at nice restaurants very often. But it goes a lot further than that. There are a bunch of different strategies that I use to save money here, which is how I managed to spend just $1,884 on food last year. I'm making an entire video on this because I think it's so important. But so far, I've covered the 3 big expenses that everyone needs to survive: housing, transportation, and food. And when you add up all of these expenses, I still have $6,996 left to spend. There's just a few more things that I need to spend money on. Health insurance cost another $1,500, and then I had about $550 in miscellaneous expenses. But even with that, I still would have had $4,946 despite living on minimum wage in this insanely expensive area. If I was truly desperate and actually had to make it on just minimum wage, that is all the money I would have spent in a year. But I did take a few trips to see friends and family, I pay for an expensive gym membership, and then there's this YouTube channel, which I've managed to lose money on. But even with all of those extra expenses, I still spent less than minimum wage. At the end of the year, I would have had $1,765.22 in savings, even if I only earned a minimum wage income. So it is possible to survive on minimum wage, even in an extremely expensive area. But I set out on this experiment to prove that anyone can retire early. So could you retire early on minimum wage? Well, yes actually, but let me show you how. The rule of thumb is that you need 25 times your annual expenses before retiring. And last year I spent $19,500.78. For simplicity, I'll round up my expenses to $20,000 per year, which means using that rule of thumb, I would need $500,000 to retire. And if I invested every single penny I saved while earning minimum wage and earned a reasonable 7% return on my investments, it would take about 45 years to save enough to retire. If you started at 18 years old, you'd be 63 when you could retire. And that is before the standard retirement age of 67 years old, although not by much. But remember that I could have spent even less. If I truly only made minimum wage, I probably would have only spent about $16,320 last year and saved $4,946. That means I would be saving more and I would need even less money to retire. So using those estimates, I could reach financial independence in just 29 years. Start at 18 and you would be financially independent at 47 years old. You could still retire faster than 99% of people despite only earning minimum wage. But look, before people get mad in the comments, let's be super clear. You do not want to only earn minimum wage. Most people do not want to live so extremely frugally forever, and I don't blame them. Reaching financial freedom is worth it to me, but I still probably won't be this frugal forever. And I've also been assuming that there are no big surprises that cost a lot of money. With a minimum wage income, there's not much room for these unexpected expenses. And maybe my most important decision is around family. It should be obvious that the only reason I'm able to spend less than $20,000 per year is because I'm only taking care of myself. If I had a partner that also worked, then things could actually be easier. Even if they only earned a minimum wage income themselves, we could probably save even more money as long as we were both extremely frugal. But kids would be super difficult, and I really just don't see how it would be possible to raise a kid on a minimum wage income without a lot of help from other people. So yes, in theory, retiring early on minimum wage actually is possible, even in an extremely expensive area, but I would not recommend it. But this is still really good news, because honestly, it's pretty unrealistic that you would only be earning minimum wage for your entire career. You'll have time to get experience and learn new skills, and your income will go up as you do. So if it's possible to retire early on minimum wage, it will be a lot easier in practice. And in an area as expensive as where I live, real minimum wage jobs are extremely rare anyway. Minimum wage is just $12 per hour in the state of Virginia. But in the most expensive cities like mine, you'll almost always see jobs that pay at least $15 an hour. That makes a huge difference, and it means you either don't have to be as frugal, or you could reach financial freedom even faster. And this last point is maybe the most important. If you look at the investment projection I showed earlier, you'll see that after 45 years of saving just $1,700 per year, you'd have only saved about $79,000. But that money still would have grown to over $500,000. Your investments can make more money than you can, and that's really why I wanted to make this video. Because no matter how much money you're making or how much money you're saving, it's possible to reach financial freedom as long as you get your money working for you. So I really do believe that almost anyone can retire early. It's just that most people don't know where to start. And that's why I created a step-by-step guide for retiring early on a low income, which I'll walk you through in this video, along with a bunch of other things that you should know.